It was a cold, rainy morning when James Carter boarded the crowded city bus. His shoes left faint, wet prints on the floor, and the smell of damp coats and coffee filled the air. He was exhausted from his night shift at the repair shop, but that bus ride was his only quiet time before heading home. His mind wandered to his mother, how she always waited up, even at dawn, with that same soft smile. He smiled faintly thinking of her, unaware that this morning would be the one that changed everything. The bus jerked forward, packed with people staring blankly at their phones, earbuds blocking out the world. James stood near the back, watching the rain trace lines on the fogged window. Then, as the doors hissed open at the next stop, a young pregnant woman stepped in. Her face was pale, her hands trembling under the weight of 2 grocery bags. Her eyes darted around for an empty seat, there was none. People avoided her gaze, pretending to scroll through their screens. James noticed that he felt a small pull in his chest, the same feeling he got every time he saw someone in need. Without hesitation, he stood up. "Ma'am," he said softly, "please take my seat." She blinked in surprise, then smiled gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered, easing down with a sigh of relief. The driver accelerated suddenly, and James reached for a handle but couldn't find balance in time. The bus jolted violently. Tires screeched, metal groaned, and screams filled the air as the world turned sideways. When James opened his eyes, everything was hazy. The bus had hit a divider. Shattered glass glittered like snow on the floor. People moaned and coughed, dazed and frightened. He tried to move, but pain shot through his leg. Then he heard crying, someone calling for help. He turned his head. The pregnant woman lay a few feet away, her seat crushed, her arms shielding her stomach. Without thinking, he crawled toward her. Every movement burned, but he reached her and used his body to protect her from debris as the bus tilted to a stop. Then darkness. When he woke again, the beeping of hospital machines filled the room. His leg was in a cast, his head bandaged. The doctor smiled gently. "You're lucky, Mr. Carter. You took quite a hit." James blinked, confused. "The woman? Is she?" "She's fine," the doctor interrupted. "So is her baby. You shielded her during the crash. She told us you saved them." James stared at the ceiling. He didn't remember that part. He only remembered the sound of her cry. Days turned into weeks. James was discharged, but recovery was slow. His leg was fractured badly, he couldn't return to work anytime soon. Bills piled up on the kitchen table beside his mother's medicine bottles. His boss, though sympathetic, had to replace him. James tried to stay positive, but his savings disappeared fast. At night, he sat by the window watching the city lights blur through the rain, whispering, maybe kindness doesn't matter anymore. Meanwhile, across town, the woman he'd saved, Sophie Miller, sat in her small apartment, unable to sleep. Every time she looked at her growing belly, she thought of the stranger who stood for her, who nearly lost his life protecting her. She tried calling the hospital, but privacy laws prevented them from giving her details. She needed to thank him, not with words, but with something real. She felt she owed him her child's life. Weeks later, Sophie tracked him down. She found his name through a mutual nurse and read about his condition. When she learned he'd lost his job, her guilt deepened. She wanted to help, but how? Sophie was a journalist on maternity leave, her career once thriving until complications forced her to step away. Now, sitting in front of her laptop, she began typing. The headline came first, "The stranger who saved my baby." She poured her heart into every word, describing how a man, whose name she didn't even know, had given up his seat and, moments later, risked his life for her and her unborn child. She ended the piece with a question: what kind of world do we live in if heroes like him are forgotten? She submitted it to her old editor, who loved it instantly. Within hours of publication, the story spread across social media. People were moved, angry, inspired. Comments flooded in, faith in humanity restored. "Find that man. We need more people like him." Donations started appearing through Sophie's linked account, people offering money for the hero's recovery, offers of help, even jobs. But Sophie didn't release his name yet. She wanted to tell him first. James, unaware of all this, was sitting at home staring at an eviction notice. The landlord had given him 2 weeks. He sighed, thinking about his mother's health and how far he'd fallen from the life he once dreamed of. Just then, there was a knock on the door. He limped to open it. Standing there was Sophie, the woman from the bus, visibly pregnant and holding an envelope. "James Carter?" she asked, tears welling up. He froze, recognizing her face. You're the lady from the bus." She nodded, her voice trembling. "You saved my life. You saved my baby's life." He tried to brush it off. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't have." She handed him the envelope. It was filled with letters, notes, and printouts of online messages from strangers thanking him for his kindness. "The world knows your story," she said softly. "I wrote about you. People want to help." He opened one note. A child had written, "You're my hero. I gave my lunch money to someone hungry today because of you." His throat tightened. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "You do," Sophie said. "That day on the bus, you thought you gave up a seat. But you gave me a future." For the first time in months, James felt something shift inside him, a spark of hope he thought he'd lost. The kindness he once believed was wasted had come back in ways he never imagined. He looked at Sophie, at her unborn child, and finally smiled. Maybe kindness still matters after all. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted, and sunlight broke through the gray sky. The city hummed as if it, too, had just remembered what compassion felt like. James stood quietly at the doorway, the sound of Sophie's footsteps fading down the hall, her promise lingering in the air. "Your kindness didn't end that day, James. It started something." He watched her disappear into the crowd, unaware that the story of his simple gesture had already reached millions. And as the sun climbed higher, James Carter whispered to himself, "Maybe it's true, one act of kindness can change everything." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of James Carter's apartment, touching the edges of his worn-out table now stacked with letters and cards from strangers. He couldn't believe how the world had responded. Just weeks ago, he was invisible, a man trying to survive, unnoticed in a city that rarely looked up from its screens. Now people called him a hero. He still felt the same, ordinary, unsure, but deeply moved by how kindness had circled back. Sophie visited often, bringing updates about the article's impact. "You changed lives without even knowing it," she said once, placing her hand over her growing belly. "Mine, most of all." He smiled, humbled. "Maybe we both got a second chance," he replied. That as donations poured in, offers followed. A local car company reached out, offering him training and a small grant to start his own repair shop. A community fundraiser launched under the name Carter's Care, meant to help people rebuild their lives after hardship. For the first time in years, James felt like his dream of owning a garage wasn't just fantasy. He'd always believed kindness had power. Now, he was watching it manifest. Still, he stayed grounded. "I'm no saint," he told Sophie one afternoon, "I just stood up." She smiled knowingly. And that's all it took to make people believe again. A few months later, Sophie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When she called James from the hospital, her voice was trembling with emotion. "I named him Carter," she said softly. He froze. "You didn't have to, I wanted to," she interrupted. "Because if you hadn't stood that day, he wouldn't be here." Silence filled the line for a moment, and then James laughed quietly, his heart full. "Well," he said, "guess I better make sure little Carter grows up in a kind world." He visited them often after that. Watching Sophie cradle her son filled him with a strange peace. The scars from the crash were still there, his limp, the ache in his leg, but now, every step felt like a reminder that pain could create purpose. The media attention faded over time, but the community didn't forget. Inspired by his story, people started their own movement. They called it Stand Up for Kindness. Videos spread of strangers giving up seats, helping neighbors, donating to those in need. The same city that once turned away now looked out for one another. James watched from afar, proud yet humble, never wanting credit. When his garage finally opened, it wasn't fancy, but it was his. A modest sign read, Carter's Care Auto, painted by local kids who'd volunteered to help. The first customers weren't there for car repairs, they came to meet the man who'd inspired them. "You gave us hope," an old woman said, pressing his hand. "You reminded us the world isn't lost." He just smiled and replied, "Hope was always there. We just forgot to look." Slowly, the business grew. He hired young men from rough neighborhoods, teaching them skills, discipline, and dignity. He told them, "Every bolt you tighten, every car you fix, it's not just work. It's how you build respect for yourself." They listened, because he spoke from experience. Meanwhile, Sophie balanced motherhood with her writing. Her articles now focused on kindness, resilience, and redemption. Her readers followed her journey with James and baby Carter closely. There was something unspoken between her and James, a bond deeper than gratitude. It wasn't romantic in the beginning, but something steady and real. He became like family, the person she called when nights were long and the baby wouldn't sleep. He was there when she needed repairs, when she needed reassurance, or just someone to laugh with. Little Carter adored him, giggling every time James walked in, reaching for his strong hands. "Uncle James," the boy would squeal, tugging his shirt. And James, with that warm grin, always picked him up as if holding the miracle he'd unknowingly helped create. Then one afternoon, an unwelcome shadow from Sophie's past returned. Her ex-husband, the man who'd abandoned her during pregnancy, showed up suddenly at her door. He saw James playing with the child and jumped to conclusions. Anger flared. He hurled accusations, loud and cruel, calling James names, questioning his intentions. James stood silently, refusing to react. "You've got it wrong," he said calmly, his voice low. "I'm just here for them." But Sophie stepped forward before he could finish. "No," she said sharply, "you're the one who left. He's the one who stayed. He saved our lives. You lost your right to judge." The street grew quiet. Neighbors peeked through windows. The ex, humiliated, stormed off. James turned to her, uneasy. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said, her eyes soft. "You saved me once. This time, I saved you." That moment changed something between them. Their connection deepened, not born of romance, but of shared strength, respect, and gratitude. James realized he didn't just save her, she'd saved him too, pulling him out of despair when he thought his life was over. A year passed. The city still remembered the bus crash that started it all. On the anniversary, a small ceremony was held for the opening of Carter's Care Auto Garage's new branch, funded by community donations. Sophie attended with her son in her arms. Reporters were there again, but this time James stood at the podium with quiet confidence. "A year ago," he said, "I thought I'd lost everything. My job, my health, my peace. But that day taught me something simple: every act of kindness is a seed. You might not see it grow right away, but one day, it blooms where you least expect it." The crowd applauded, many wiping tears. Sophie looked at him, proud and full of warmth. As life settled, James found joy in small things: the laughter in his shop, the purr of an engine, the way baby Carter toddled toward him saying, "Up." The world felt different now, lighter, softer. He often thought about that bus ride. How one small gesture, a seat offered, had rewritten his destiny. He'd never asked for fame, and when people called him a hero, he always replied, "I just did what I hoped someone would do for my mom." One evening, after closing the shop, James sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and rose. Sophie arrived with dinner, little Carter asleep in her arms. She sat beside him quietly, both of them watching the street lights flicker on. "It's strange," she said softly, "how one moment can change everything." He nodded. "Yeah," he whispered, "and it all started with a seat." She laughed quietly. "Maybe the universe just needed you to stand up first." They sat there in silence, comforted by the hum of life around them, the sound of cars passing, laughter from a nearby cafe, the warmth of belonging. Before leaving, Sophie placed a small envelope on his lap. Inside was a simple drawing: crayon scribbles from little Carter. A stick figure with big arms labeled Uncle James. Beneath it, Sophie had written, "You gave him a chance to draw his future." He watched them walk away under the streetlight, the soft glow framing them like a memory he'd never forget. As the night settled, James looked up at the stars and whispered, "Sometimes, the smallest acts make the loudest echoes." In the distance, a bus rolled by, its light streaking across the dark street. Through the window,